Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here, and I've been told I need to use the mic, so I shall. I wouldn't normally, is that okay? Okay. I wouldn't normally in a room this size use it, but apparently it's being filmed for those of you who are not here. Mary McDonough. So I shall use the mic. Let me get started. And I feel a bit chagrined at Father Claudio's introduction, because I hardly consider myself an experienced professor to the degree that some of my learned colleagues are here at St. Peter's. A bit of my background: I came to St. Peter's 5 years ago. This is my 5th academic year. And a bit of the reason that I became interested in how do we incorporate elements of who Ignatius was and what he became into the way I teach has to do with the story of how I came to be here. So you can think of this as sort of a reflection of my journey, or at least a piece of my journey. And yes, it's a bit more than midlife. I spent a 35-year career in business, and I worked for very large companies, Fortune 100 companies, and I worked for very small companies, as in entrepreneurial startup ventures during those halcyon days of yore in the internet startup, and I worked for mid-market companies. And one of the opportunities that I was given arriving at St. Peter's was an opportunity to teach leadership. And I jumped at that opportunity because, with a combination of 35 years in business and 4 years in the United States Army, I recognized that in 39 years of professional life, I had had subordinates reporting to me for 38 of those 39 years. So I've been in a leadership position with subordinates reporting to me for 38 of 39 years. And I was fascinated with the topic of leadership. And so I teach the courses in the business school on our introduction to leadership and some of our advanced courses in leadership. So what I'm going to be taking you through here in the next 15 minutes or so is a little bit of the why. Why did I think this made sense to do? How, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the experimentation and how I kind of figured it out and how I do the assessment and revision and deployment and all that kind of jazz, but I am going to spend some time on the learning aspect of it. And then I'll kind of wrap it up with specifically what I do in the leadership classroom to incorporate elements of Ignatian pedagogy, if you will. Okay? Now, I became fascinated with a pretty simple question, and that was, hey, if I'm going to teach at a Jesuit institution, I better try to learn a little bit about who this guy, Ignatius Loyola, was. And I didn't know a whole lot about him. In fact, I was educated by the Dominicans, and I knew that the Jesuits, ran a bunch of colleges and universities and high schools, and I knew they were pretty smart guys. And I knew that a lot of their schools had pretty good basketball teams. And that's kind of it. And I knew that, he was a saint and he was a nobleman, lived 450 years or so ago. And that's about it. And I had this aha moment. And when I started to learn more about who Ignatius was, and that was that this individual, in addition to his work at Counter-Reformation, also was an incredibly powerful leader and developed a style of leadership from which we could learn a lot, and perhaps that I could incorporate into how I teach our students here about leadership. So that was my kind of light bulb moment, my aha moment. And you know, I'm reminded of the story, which I'm told you have not yet heard. I know that Father Rocco and Father Claudia have heard it about a dozen times, but I also know they're very polite, so they might chuckle at it. Well, it seems that three priests were strolling down the Jersey Shore for a walk, and it was a Jesuit, a Dominican, and a Franciscan. And they were out for a nice afternoon stroll, and lo and behold, they see the Holy Family here on earth strolling the other way. Now, Jesus at the time, he had just finished his bar mitzvah, so he was like 12 or 13 years old, and they're strolling down the beach, and the three priests are strolling in the other way, and suddenly the priests recognize who is coming in the opposite direction. And so the Franciscan immediately throws himself on the sand, prostrates himself, and starts giving thanks to this miraculous vision that has occurred. And the Dominican, of course, falls on his knees, and he goes into deep contemplative thought about the miracle of the triune God. Now the Jesuit, he walks up to St. Joseph, and he puts his arm around him, and he says, "Let's talk about where that boy of yours is going to school." So the Jesuits know a lot about education, and in addition to all the other things they did, they started one of the largest institutions of secondary and higher education, and it remains so to this day from a private, non-governmental standpoint. So I start out my classes in leadership in the business school with this quote from John Kennedy: "Leadership and learning are indispensable to each other." And I try to get the students to think about why this possibly is so. And why is it that leadership and learning are so indispensable to one another? And I think it makes sense to start this little conversation with talking about kind of my learning experience. And it was my good fortune when I came here about 5 years ago. I mean, early on in the first month, Father Salazar, who's no longer here at the college, put on as part of David Surrey's faculty development process, a workshop entitled "From the Spiritual Exercises to the Classroom, an Introduction to Ignatian Pedagogy." And it was a really, really wonderful learning experience. And I learned a lot from that. And as a result of that, I went to him and said, "Hey, can you recommend some other things for me to learn, particularly in the context of leadership?" And he recommended 2 books, Heroic Leadership, Chris Lowney, a former managing director of Morgan Stanley Japan, and by the way, a former Jesuit seminarian, and Next Generation Leadership, written by a guy by the name of William Byron, a Jesuit. I've also found it very helpful to read the Jesuit Journal of Jesuit Business Education, and there's really a fascinating read in there called Ignatian Pedagogical Paradigm, and so from that and from those books and from that reading, I kind of try to incorporate some of this into the leadership classroom. So from a what standpoint, what I try to do is demonstrate the consistency and the harmony of some of secular leadership teaching with actually some of the concepts associated with the way in which Ignatian leadership works, or at least Ignatian leadership as interpreted by, in this case, Lee and Copeland, or as interpreted by Chris Lowney, or as interpreted by Byron. Okay, and one of the things that Hughes and Gannett and Kurthy, who wrote the textbook that I use, talk about is an idea that they call the AOR model: action, observation, reflection. Okay, where action has to do with what were the actions that took place by the leader. Observation is kind of what effect did it have on others, and then the reflection is how do I see myself as a result of that, and how do others see myself? And I was taken by the consistency of that with what Lee and Copeland talk about in the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, which they describe as context, experience, reflection, action, evaluation. Again, extracting from the spiritual exercises the 5 elements which they define to be kind of the essence of this Ignatian manner of teaching leadership. And so within the classroom, what I point out is the parallels here between this very secular notion of leadership and that which was first articulated and in the methods that were employed in the creation of the Society of Jesus and some of the things that they accomplished. Now, I'm not going to go through, details of what each of those are. I think they're pretty much self-explanatory. Context being the environment in which the learning or the leadership takes place. Experiential learning, okay, we all know what that is. Reflection, again, highly consistent. Let's take a look and let's think about what our actions have resulted in, and then the evaluation, the evaluative portion of it, which I know that you've talked about here in this class, because I've taken a look at your syllabus. Now, this is not only consistent and harmonic with business leadership teaching, but it's highly consistent, believe it or not, with another institution that I've got some experience with. And this, by the way, is the U.S. Army's leadership growth model, where they talk about the acquisition of knowledge through reading, through observation, through studying theory, through coursework, and then reflection as part of, and by the way, these are their words, self-awareness, okay? Journaling, I know something that is actually, very explicit as part of the spiritual exercises. And then, again, the experience aspect associated with what we would call experiential learning. But notice the consistency between what the Army teaches, their new leader growth model, and what Lee and Copeland call the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. Highly consistent. Now, one of the tomes that has been in print, I don't know, for 10 years, a dozen years, is a huge journal called the Handbook of Leadership Teaching, and it's edited by 3 guys out of HBS. And what they did, interestingly, is the subtitle of this Journal of Leadership Teaching turns out to be this: knowing, doing, and being. Knowing, doing, and being. And in a sense, I felt knowing, doing, and being maybe is an even better and more succinct way of capturing these elements of Ignatian pedagogy, especially when when you apply within those three ideas of knowing, doing, and being, the following. And so how I bring this to life in the classroom is, okay, knowing has to do with the theoretical approach. So we teach theories associated with the equity theory, the great man theory, the motivational theory, the servant leadership theory. Show models of leadership and power associated with the power model, the situational leadership model, the so-called ocean model of personality as it affects leadership. All going into the know portion. But the do portion, the experiential, has to do with exercises that I put the class through where they experience being a leader, solving a problem, giving a talk, managing a work study group, okay? Writing about it, documenting it in a concise manner. And then various techniques, tools that can be used. AER, after event review. Leadership grid, which helps a leader understand relationship between the accomplishment of a task and the orientation towards subordinates. But maybe the most important aspect of this is the third, and the being. And in being, I talked about things associated with integrity and values and character. Okay? So, leadership, I assert to them and to us, is not a cookbook. It's not a recipe that if you do this and this and this and this and stick it in the oven, boom, you'll come out a great leader. It's not. It's not, because overlaying all of that are elements associated with integrity and value and character, honesty, trustworthiness, integrity, rectitude, work ethic, all of the things that make the difference between someone saying, I trust that leader to do the right thing, and simply saying, well, they're my boss. So these things cannot come out of simply theoretical approaches to leadership. And most leadership textbooks, candidly, focus on this stuff and none of this stuff. Now, the interesting part of this is, believe it or not, these three gentlemen from Harvard, Snook, Noria, and Karuna, who developed this Handbook for Leadership Education, actually borrowed this from the United States Army. And the United States Army's actually reordered this. And you're going to find this fascinating, because the order that the Army teaches it is be, know, do. Be, know, do. In other words, you first have to know thyself, and you first have to understand these virtues. Because without that, the rest of it is simply filling in the blank. Now, I don't mean to represent that Ignatius Loyola was, an early thinker for the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command. That's not what I'm asserting. I do assert, however, that the first institution in the United States to teach leadership was West Point. I also know that if you were to roll back the clock only 50 years to the 1960s, take a guess at how many times leadership was mentioned in the course catalog. Of course, this is before websites. The course catalog of Harvard Business School. Anyone want to know? The entire course catalog? The answer is 0. If you were to take a look at the Harvard Business School course catalog, the website today, in all of its courses, it's mentioned almost 200 times. Okay? The point there, ladies and gentlemen, is that never before in business, the discipline that I've spent a professional lifetime in, has there been a more pressing need to develop leaders with honesty and loyalty and virtue and character. And if we can do anything here, it is to help our young men and women nurture those kinds of attributes. Thank you.